I've always believed that a mother's love is unconditional, unwavering, and boundless. That was the lesson I learned from my own mother, and it became my truth as I raised Lily. The years passed quickly, too quickly. One moment, she was a toddler, holding my hand as we walked to the park, and the next, she was an adult with her own life, her own family, and somewhere in between, I sacrificed every dream I had for her. My marriage to Daniel had faltered long before I ever imagined it would. The love between us faded slowly, like a candle burning out in the dark. We argued more than we spoke, and he grew distant, convinced that the responsibility of raising Lily was mine alone. I didn't mind at first. I loved her, and I wanted to give her everything. But slowly, I began to lose pieces of myself, small pieces at first, like my career, my sense of self-worth, my passions, but in the end, I gave up everything. Daniel didn't care. He was never around, always immersed in his work or his own pursuits. The loneliness was a constant companion. But Lily needed me. She always came first. When Lily was in school, I juggled multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. When she became a teenager, I put aside my own social life to attend every event, every school meeting, every performance. I was there for her in ways I never could be for myself. I even put our home on the line when the bills piled up, because there was nothing I wouldn't do for her. Now, Lily was grown. She had a job, a house, and, perhaps more importantly, she had a husband, Chris. He was charming at first, but over the years, he showed his true colors. He didn't have the same respect for me that Lily did. I could see the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was just another piece of furniture in the room, something to tolerate, but not truly value. It didn't matter. Lily was my world. I could still remember the first time I held her, how small she felt in my arms, how the weight of her made everything else seem insignificant. I did my best to make sure she never felt that weight, the weight of sacrifice that had come to define me. But now things were different. It started as a typical morning. The air outside was cool, and I had just finished making breakfast when I got the call. I'd been working at the same company for over a decade, and that morning, they told me they were letting me go. The reasons were vague: downsizing, budget cuts, but the truth didn't matter. I knew I was expendable. I'd seen it coming. The company had been struggling for a while, and I'd always been the last to be considered for promotions or raises. But it still stung. Deep down, the rug was pulled out from under me in an instant. I hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space before me. There was no plan for this, no safety net. The savings I had carefully tucked away for Lily's future now seemed like a drop in the ocean compared to the debt I had accumulated keeping everything afloat. Lily and Chris were sitting at the breakfast table, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I told her what had happened, expecting some kind of support, maybe even sympathy. After all, I had always been there for her. But instead, Lily barely looked up from her phone. "That's rough, Mom," she said, barely glancing in my direction. "I guess you'll have to find something else." I felt the words cut into me, but I tried to remain calm. I had to keep it together, for Lily. "Do you think we could talk about this later?" Lily continued, now more focused on her screen than the conversation. "I've got work, and Chris and I have plans to go out of town this weekend." Plans. Of course. I swallowed my frustration. She was busy, and I wasn't her priority. I had to remind myself, she was an adult now, with her own life, but still. I had given up everything for her. Everything. "Right," I said softly, trying to mask the ache in my chest. "I understand." I left the table, retreating to my room where I could sit quietly with my thoughts. The emptiness in my chest grew, filling every corner of my mind. And then, a knock on the door. "Mom, can we talk?" Lily's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it I couldn't ignore. I opened the door, and there she stood, her arms crossed, her face hard. "I think it's time you move out," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Chris and I can't keep taking care of you. It's too much. You need to figure something out, or you'll be a burden." The words stung, but what hurt even more was the coldness in her eyes. I stared at her, my daughter, the person I had sacrificed everything for, and I realized something in that moment. I had given so much of myself that I no longer recognized the person standing before me. She had become someone who barely saw me, someone who didn't understand, or maybe didn't care about the life I had built around her. I couldn't stay in that moment. I had to get away, to think. But before I could speak, she turned and walked away, as if nothing had happened. I closed the door quietly behind me, the weight of her words pressing down on my chest. I sank onto the bed, my mind spinning. Was this really how things had ended up, after everything I had done? It felt like a dream, like an awful, cruel dream, but I knew it wasn't. This was real, and something inside me began to shift, something deep and powerful. The time had come. I would no longer let myself be treated this way. But what did that even mean? I had no answers, just questions, and the questions echoed in my head as I sat there, alone, finally starting to confront the reality I had been avoiding for so long. The days that followed Lily's harsh words felt like they blurred together, each one heavier than the last. I spent most of my time in a daze, alternating between anger and sorrow. I couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad. The pain of her rejection gnawed at me, but a part of me knew something had to change. I wasn't going to keep putting myself last. But where could I go from here? Lily's demand to move out had stung, but it wasn't just the act of it. It was the finality, the certainty in her voice, as if there was no room for negotiation, no recognition of the years I had dedicated to her. I thought back to when she was young, when she needed me for everything. I'd always been there, bending over backward to make sure she had everything she wanted. And yet, here I was, nothing more than a burden. My phone buzzed. It was an email from my former employer. It was a severance package, a minimal payout for my years of loyalty. It wasn't much, but it was something. I stared at the number, trying to let it sink in, but my thoughts drifted back to the day I had been let go. The company hadn't even offered me an explanation. They just told me to pack up my things and leave. My career, gone in an instant. But then, something caught my eye, an attachment to the email. I opened it hesitantly. It wasn't a severance package after all. The file contained a letter from my former boss, a man I had worked with for over a decade. He had always been kind, but I never knew the extent of his gratitude until now. It turned out that he had left me something in his will. I almost didn't believe it at first, my hands shaking as I read the words. In recognition of your dedication and hard work, I have left you an inheritance of $10 million. The amount was staggering, far more than I had expected or ever imagined. It was a gift, no, more than that, it was a lifeline. At first, I didn't know what to think. A part of me felt guilty for even accepting it, but another part of me felt something else, something like power, like control. For the first time in a long time, I realized I could make my own choices. I could stop being the person everyone expected me to be. But the question remained, what should I do now? That evening, after the initial shock of the inheritance had worn off, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table. Lily and Chris were having dinner together, but neither of them spoke to me. Lily kept her eyes down, focusing on her food, while Chris muttered something under his breath. The tension in the room was palpable, and I felt more out of place than ever. I could feel the weight of the inheritance pressing on me, but more than that, I could feel the weight of my decisions. My entire life, I had put others first. It was as though I had built a cage around myself, locked in by my own sense of duty. But now I had a choice. The money was mine, and no one could take it from me. Lily, I said, my voice soft but steady, we need to talk. She glanced up from her plate, an unreadable expression on her face. About what, Mom? I took a deep breath. The words I had rehearsed in my head didn't feel nearly as strong now that I was about to speak them. I've been thinking, I started slowly, choosing each word carefully. I've spent my whole life giving everything I have to you, to this family, and I've been treated like I don't matter. I've been a burden to you, haven't I? Lily stiffened, but didn't respond. Chris, on the other hand, raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? You're fine, aren't you? I glanced at him, feeling a flicker of frustration. No, Chris, I'm not fine. I've been supporting you two for years, doing everything I can to make your lives easier, and this is how I'm repaid. Chris scoffed. Don't make it sound like we owe you something. The words hit me like a slap across the face. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him how selfish and ungrateful he was, but something stopped me. I realized then that I didn't need their approval anymore. You know what? I said, standing up from the table. I don't need to do this anymore. I don't need to be your punching bag. Lily's eyes widened. What are you saying, Mom? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I've been given a chance to make something of myself. A real chance, and I'm going to take it. Before she could respond, I turned and walked out of the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. I didn't know what I would do with this new freedom, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let them make me feel small anymore. The following days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the money and what it could mean for me. I was still in disbelief that I could make such drastic changes to my life, but I also knew that if I didn't act soon, I would fall back into the same routine of living for others, of being the person they expected me to be. I made some calls, met with a financial advisor, and started to get a sense of what was possible. One thing became clear very quickly: I could afford to live differently. I could afford a life where I didn't have to rely on anyone, where I didn't have to beg for scraps of attention or love. But my newfound wealth also made me question everything I had ever believed about myself. Was I just the woman who worked herself into the ground for others, or was I capable of more? It was time to find out. And so, I began to make plans. The first step was to find a place for myself, a place where I could truly start fresh, away from Lily, Chris, and the life I had built around them. I wasn't sure where I would go, but I knew one thing: it wouldn't be back to the life I'd just left behind. The first few days after I decided to take control of my life were a whirlwind. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied down by anyone else's expectations. I wasn't just the woman who catered to the needs of others. I was me. I kept reminding myself of that fact, even though it felt surreal. How had I let so much time slip by without even questioning what I wanted? Lily's silence was deafening. She didn't reach out. She didn't apologize. And, to be honest, I didn't expect her to. I knew, deep down, that the hurt between us was too deep to be fixed by words alone. But I also knew I had to move forward. I couldn't allow myself to get caught in the cycle of waiting for her to come around. This was my chance to live my life without apology. I started by meeting with a real estate agent. After a few hours of viewing properties, I realized just how much the inheritance had changed things. I could afford a home that was more than just a roof over my head. I could afford something beautiful, something that reflected the woman I was becoming. I found the place by accident, an elegant house perched on a hill overlooking a serene lake. The moment I stepped inside, I knew this was where I was meant to be. It was spacious and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the light and offered breathtaking views. The rooms were airy and filled with potential. A library, a study, a sunroom, places I had only dreamed of having for myself. The real estate agent seemed surprised when I made an offer almost immediately. I hadn't even paused to think about it. It felt right, like the universe was nudging me in this direction. And it was a far cry from the cramped apartment I had lived in for years, barely big enough for the three of us, where I had spent countless nights wondering what life would have been like if I hadn't always put others first. The paperwork went through quickly. My offer was accepted, and within weeks, I was moving into my new home. The first night I spent there, I felt a deep sense of peace, as though I had finally come home to myself. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely without the weight of obligations holding me down. Back at my old apartment, Lily and Chris had not made any attempt to contact me. My decision to move out permanently had been made, and I was resolute. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what they thought. Had they expected me to cave? Had they assumed that they could continue to control me? I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. One day, I received a call from Chris. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. I knew it had to be him. "Hey, it's Chris. We need to talk," he said, his voice laced with a hint of frustration. I let out a breath, steadying myself. "About what, Chris? You can't just up and leave like that. You're abandoning Lily. She's hurt, and frankly, so am I. You owe us an explanation." I felt a knot in my stomach, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I don't owe either of you anything," I said, my voice firm. "I've spent years sacrificing for you both. I've always put Lily's needs ahead of my own. And now, I'm taking the time to figure out what I need. I'm not going to let you treat me like an afterthought anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Chris spoke again. "You're being selfish. You know that?" "Maybe," I replied, "but at least for once, I'm being true to myself." With that, I hung up. That evening, after my conversation with Chris, I sat at my new dining room table and reflected on everything that had led me here. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. This new chapter in my life wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, and maybe even more people who tried to tear me down. But I couldn't let that stop me. I had already spent too many years afraid of disappointing others. It was time to stop apologizing for choosing myself. The phone buzzed again, another call from Lily. I hesitated for a moment before answering. This time, I would listen. For the first time, I would hear what she had to say on my terms. Mom? Her voice sounded small, almost hesitant. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I've been awful, and I don't know what's gotten into me. I've taken you for granted for so long. You've always done everything for me, and I didn't appreciate it. I'm sorry. For a moment, I was quiet, processing the words. It wasn't the apology I had been waiting for, but it was a start. I appreciate you saying that, Lily, I said softly, but I need you to understand that my life doesn't revolve around what you need anymore. I have to live for me, for the first time in my life, and I hope you can respect that. I understand, she replied. I don't want to lose you. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. You won't lose me, but things are different now. I can't be the person I was before. I need time to figure out who I am without constantly taking care of everyone else. There was a long pause on the other end, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she truly understood. But I couldn't hold on to the hope of a perfect reconciliation. The truth was, I didn't know what would happen next, but that was okay. I had taken the first step toward creating a life that was truly my own, and that was enough for now. In the days that followed, I settled into my new life, one that was quieter, more intentional. I began exploring my new neighborhood, quiet streets lined with trees, a small cafe by the lake, and peaceful parks where I could walk and think. I felt like I had been reborn, and every day brought new possibilities. I also began to plan for the future. I enrolled in an online course, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I found joy in the small things, sipping coffee on my deck, reading a book, even just walking around the lake and feeling the sun on my face. I was starting to remember who I was before I became a mother, before I became someone's caretaker. It was a strange feeling, but it was also exhilarating. The weeks passed, and with each one, I felt myself becoming more and more comfortable in my new life. I had transformed from the woman who bent herself to the whims of others into someone who was finally embracing the freedom I had so long been denied. I no longer had to check in with anyone, seek permission, or live in fear of being judged. Every choice I made, no matter how small, was mine to make. It was both exhilarating and, at times, unsettling. For so many years, I had been driven by obligation, and now, with that weight lifted, I often found myself pausing, wondering what my next step should be. The new house felt like a sanctuary. Its spacious rooms allowed me to spread out in ways I had never known before. There were corners to hide away in, spaces to reflect, and places to dream. I created a small home office by the window where I could work on the online courses I had enrolled in, and when I needed a break, I wandered the lakeside paths, taking in the calming views. But as I settled into this new chapter, I couldn't help but feel the gnawing uncertainty about what the future held. I knew one thing for sure, I had to do something meaningful with my life. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was a symbol of everything I had sacrificed to get here, and now it felt like the key to unlocking the life I had always dreamed of. One afternoon, as I sat in my new study reviewing a course on interior design, something I had always been fascinated with but never had the chance to explore, I heard a knock at the door. It was a sound I wasn't used to. I had been living in peaceful isolation for the last few weeks, and while I was enjoying the quiet, part of me still feared what the outside world would bring. I opened the door, and standing there were Lily and Chris. Lily's face was drawn, her eyes red as if she had been crying. Chris stood beside her, his arms crossed in what appeared to be a defensive stance. The sight of them standing there, together, made my heart twist. I hadn't expected them to come. I thought I had made myself clear that things had changed, that I was no longer the same person they could walk all over. But here they were, showing up uninvited. Lily hesitated, glancing at Chris before speaking. Mom, we need to talk. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. There was no escaping this conversation, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But I had to face it. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Once inside, Lily and Chris sat down, both of them looking at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Lily spoke first. "I know I've hurt you. I've been selfish, and I didn't understand how much you gave up for me until now." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am." I sat quietly, trying to process her words. I wanted to believe them, but it was hard after everything that had happened. "You're right," I said softly, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "You've hurt me, but you weren't the only one who was selfish. I spent so many years giving up myself for you, for your happiness, and I never stopped to ask if it was what I wanted. That's something I have to live with." Chris looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting between Lily and me. He cleared his throat, obviously trying to avoid confrontation. "We're not here to make things worse," he said awkwardly. "We just wanted to explain, well, things have been rough for us too. We've been struggling, and maybe we didn't show it. But we realize now how much we took you for granted." I stared at him, letting the words sink in. For the longest time, I had lived in their shadows, only to be made to feel small when I couldn't give them what they wanted. Now, it seemed like they were asking for my forgiveness, but it felt too late. "You've always known I was there for you," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But now, I'm going to be there for myself. I can't keep giving at the cost of my own well-being." Lily seemed to understand, her gaze softening. "I know, Mom. I don't expect you to give up your life for us anymore. I guess I'm just scared of losing you completely." Her vulnerability surprised me. I had been so angry, so hurt, that I had never taken the time to consider how much she must have been struggling with all of this. Too, the reality was that she had never been taught how to stand on her own. Maybe, in some ways, I had made her dependent on me. "I'm not going anywhere, Lily," I replied, "but I am going to live my life differently now. I've spent too many years being afraid of what would happen if I put myself first, but I can't do that anymore." Chris looked between us, and though his expression remained guarded, I could see the change in him. Perhaps he had learned something in all of this, too. His tone shifted as he stood up to leave. "We're not asking you to give up your independence," he said quietly, "but if you could, just keep us in your life, maybe?" I nodded slowly. "I'm willing to try," I said, "but it has to be different now. I can't keep being the person who's always at your service." As they left, I stood in the doorway, feeling a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I had set boundaries, and more importantly, I had shown them that I was no longer afraid to live my own life. That night, as I sat alone in my new home, the silence felt comfortable, but it also brought clarity. I wasn't just trying to start over. I was reclaiming everything I had lost over the years, the power I had given away without realizing it was mine to take back. The money from my inheritance wasn't just a financial windfall, it was a symbol of the power I now held over my own future. I started researching philanthropic projects, ways I could use some of my wealth to help others. I had spent so many years giving to the people closest to me, but now I wanted to give back to the world, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. That was the next step for me. I would use this new life to rebuild myself, to help others, and to remind myself that I had always had the power to shape my own destiny. As I continued to settle into my new life, I realized that this wasn't just about physical space, it was about reshaping the very essence of who I was. The house, with its open spaces and panoramic views, wasn't just a new place to live, it was a blank canvas, a place where I could begin to explore who I was beyond the roles of mother and caretaker. I needed to reclaim myself, and for the first time, I had the freedom to do that. In the weeks that followed, I spent my time reflecting on everything that had led me here. I was no longer the woman who waited for others to give me permission to be myself. I had learned the hard way that living for others left me hollow, exhausted, and resentful. I was done with that. My inheritance wasn't just a financial gift, it was a lifeline, a signal that I didn't have to live by anyone else's standards anymore. I had always dreamed of having my own business, but I had buried that dream for years, telling myself that it was too selfish, too impractical. Now, with the financial cushion of my inheritance, the opportunity was finally within reach. I sat down at my new dining table one evening, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. I had my laptop open, and I began researching what it would take to start a design firm. Interior design was something I had always loved, but it was a passion I'd pushed aside in favor of the more practical duties of raising a family. But no longer. I knew that if I was ever going to be happy, I had to pursue what truly excited me. I reached out to a few contacts in the industry, some of whom I had worked with during my years at the corporate job I had left behind. The connections were sparse, but they were there. A few hours of research led me to a handful of business consultants who specialized in helping people like me, women who had spent their lives supporting others but were now ready to create something for themselves. With their help, I began drafting a business plan. The concept was simple: a boutique interior design service that specialized in creating tranquil, elegant spaces for individuals who were looking for a peaceful, refined environment. I had always loved the idea of combining style and functionality to create spaces where people could relax and feel at home. I realized that, in many ways, I was designing more than just rooms. I was designing experiences, helping people build lives that reflected their inner peace. Getting the business off the ground wasn't easy. There were many sleepless nights spent tweaking the website, refining the services I would offer, and learning how to market myself. It was daunting, and at times, I felt overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. But then, I remembered something important. I wasn't doing this for anyone else. I was doing it for me. The first few clients were small, word-of-mouth referrals, people who had heard of my work through the grapevine or had seen my design ideas on my social media. But each job, no matter how small, filled me with pride. I was finally able to pour my passion into something that was truly mine. And with each project, my confidence grew. I hired a few part-time assistants to help with the administrative tasks, giving me more space to focus on the creative side of things. The work wasn't just fulfilling, it was exhilarating. I felt like I was waking up to a version of myself I hadn't even known existed. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to life, I was actively shaping it. In the midst of all the changes in my professional life, I also began to notice a shift in my personal life. The time I had spent on my own, rediscovering my passions and desires, had made me more open to new relationships, ones that weren't based on obligation but on mutual respect and understanding. One day, while out at a local art gallery, I ran into someone I had known years ago. His name was Jack. He was a former colleague of mine, someone I had always admired for his creativity and vision. Back then, I had admired him from afar, but the circumstances of our lives had never aligned in a way that would allow anything to develop. But now, in this new chapter of my life, I felt different. I was no longer the woman who lived in the background, watching life pass me by. I was a woman who had made her own choices, and I wasn't afraid to take risks anymore. We struck up a conversation, and it quickly became clear that there was still a connection between us. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my work. The chemistry was undeniable, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to open up to the possibility of something more. Our dates were simple: coffee in the morning, walks by the lake, shared moments of laughter, but they were also deeply meaningful, as though we were rediscovering parts of ourselves that had been lost for a long time. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. With each passing day, I felt more and more like the woman I was meant to be. My business began to grow, and my reputation as a designer started to spread. I had taken my passion and turned it into a thriving career, one that gave me not only financial independence but also a sense of purpose. I was no longer just a mother, a wife, a caretaker. I was a woman with a vision, a woman who had chosen to live on her own terms. But the most powerful realization was this: I wasn't just living for myself, I was living as an example for others. For the first time in my life, I understood that the best way to help the people I loved was to show them that they didn't have to settle for anything less than what they deserved. When Lily and Chris reached out again, I could feel the difference in their tone. They weren't asking me for anything anymore. They weren't trying to make me feel guilty or indebted. They were simply acknowledging the changes I had made, and I could sense that they were beginning to respect me in a way they never had before. Our relationship was still fragile, but I had learned not to rush it. I knew that if I kept living authentically, the people who truly mattered would come along for the ride. As I stood on the balcony of my new home one evening, looking out over the lake, I realized that I had finally become the woman I was always meant to be. I wasn't perfect, no one ever is, but I was free. Free to live, to create, to love, and to be loved. I had learned that life didn't have to be about sacrifice, that it was okay to pursue your own dreams and desires. And as I gazed at the sun dipping below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had taken control of my life, and nothing, no one, could take that away from me. In the end, it wasn't about the money, the success, or even the relationships I had rebuilt. It was about reclaiming my power and using it to build a future where I could be the woman I was always meant to be.